There are moments in life when the world feels so chaotic that finding a slice of peace becomes the ultimate treasure. For me, that peace was found in a quaint lake cabin tucked away in a serene corner of the countryside. It wasn't just a structure made of timber and nails, it was a symbol of hard work, patience, and family memories spanning decades. This cabin had been passed down for generations, a place where birthdays, holidays, and spontaneous weekend getaways turned into lifelong stories. When I inherited the property, I knew it was more than just land and walls, it was history. The moment I stepped inside for the first time, I felt its warmth, a gentle mix of nostalgia and comfort. The wooden beams bore the marks of time, and the old rocking chair by the fireplace creaked in a way that reminded me of my grandparents. Everything about the cabin screamed simplicity, the very thing modern life lacked. However, owning property, no matter how secluded, always comes with strings attached. And those strings, as I would soon learn, were controlled by an entity I had barely heard of until then, the Homeowners Association, or HOA. When I first received their introductory letter, I laughed it off. A cabin by a lake, far from bustling neighborhoods, and yet somehow tied to a local HOA? It sounded absurd. The letter was polite enough at first. It welcomed me to the Lake Serenity community, and detailed a list of guidelines, upkeep standards, landscaping rules, even the type of mailbox I was allowed to install. But buried in fine print was the mention of mandatory HOA fees, along with penalties for late payments. Initially, I didn't think much of it. I wasn't against paying my share to maintain the shared amenities. After all, the roads leading to the cabin were maintained by someone, and the lake remained pristine thanks to community efforts. So, I paid the first few invoices without question. Then, as time went on, the letters started changing tone. What began as friendly reminders morphed into stern notices, layered with legal jargon and veiled threats. According to them, my payments were consistently late, something I knew wasn't true. I had bank records proving every payment was made on time. Frustrated, I tried calling their office, but every attempt led to endless hold times and generic responses. The situation spiraled when I received a notice claiming I was now months behind on payments, an outright lie. Attached was a figure so inflated it was laughable, coupled with a deadline and an ominous warning about further action. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just bureaucratic incompetence. But then came the first real sign that this wasn't a simple clerical error, a certified letter stating that if I didn't settle the so-called overdue amount, the HOA would pursue property compliance measures. Those words haunted me for days. What did property compliance even mean? I asked around, speaking with a few locals who lived near the lake. The stories they shared chilled me to the bone. The HOA wasn't just a group of community volunteers, they were relentless enforcers, using fines, liens, and even foreclosures to assert dominance. One neighbor spoke of a family who had their dock dismantled overnight because it didn't meet safety standards. Another recounted how someone's shed was bulldozed for being non-compliant. Still, I refused to bow down to what I saw as extortion. I filed formal disputes, mailed copies of my receipts, and even hired a local attorney to send a warning letter. Weeks passed with no acknowledgement. Instead, the HOA doubled down, sending another demand, this time with a threat to take decisive action if payment wasn't received. I spent countless nights staring at those letters, anger and disbelief simmering inside me. This wasn't about fees anymore, it was about control. They had picked me as their next target, perhaps thinking I was an easy mark, a lone cabin owner with no backing. Little did they know, they were about to make the biggest mistake of their existence. Because I wasn't just a regular property owner. My entire family, every single one of us, worked as federal agents. And while I had chosen a quiet life by the lake, I still had resources, connections, and a deep understanding of the law. I knew how to fight back. But before I could act, something happened that changed everything. One Friday afternoon, after a long week at work, I decided to drive down to the cabin for some peace. As I turned onto the gravel road leading to my property, I noticed something odd. an unusual emptiness where my cabin should have stood. My heart raced as I pulled up to the clearing, and the sight before me nearly dropped me to my knees. The cabin, the one my family had cherished for generations, was gone. Not damaged, not vandalized. Gone. In its place was a patch of freshly leveled dirt, as if the structure had never existed. A single laminated sign stood on a stake, its bold black letters declaring, "Property cleared due to non-compliance and unpaid HOA fees." In that moment, I felt a mix of rage and disbelief so intense it blurred my vision. They hadn't just crossed a line, they had obliterated it. And they had no idea who they were messing with. The HOA thought they had won. But this was only the beginning. The human mind has an uncanny way of freezing in moments of overwhelming shock. Standing there on that bare patch of earth, staring at what used to be my family's most cherished retreat, I felt as if time had stopped. My mind tried to reject the reality before me, searching for logical explanations, but there were none that made sense. The cabin wasn't damaged or in disrepair, it had been erased from existence, and the audacity behind this act was almost incomprehensible. I walked toward the laminated sign, each step echoing with a growing fury. The message was blunt, unapologetic, and almost mocking: property cleared due to non-compliance and unpaid HOA fees. Beneath those words was the HOA's logo, along with a date and an invoice number. My hands trembled as I tore the sign out of the ground and hurled it into the woods. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the vacant space where memories once lived. This wasn't just a property, it was part of my family's soul. Generations had built, maintained, and loved this cabin. And in a single, calculated act, the HOA had destroyed it without due process, without proper legal standing, without any respect for human decency. The anger I felt wasn't just personal, it was primal. But beneath the fury was a cold clarity. These people thought they could intimidate me, strong-arm me into submission, and erase something that mattered so deeply. They believed their so-called authority gave them unlimited power. They were wrong. When I returned to my car, I didn't drive home immediately. Instead, I sat behind the wheel, staring out at the lake glistening under the fading sun. My thoughts shifted from despair to strategy. As federal agents, my family and I had dealt with criminals of all kinds, white-collar schemers, organized syndicates, you name it. And in many ways, the HOA's tactics weren't far off. They thrived on fear, confusion, and manipulation. The first thing I did was document everything. I took pictures of the empty lot from every angle, close-ups of the sign, and even the tire tracks leading away from the site. Then I pulled out my phone and began making calls. The first was to my older brother, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for dismantling complex fraud networks. When he answered, I kept my voice calm, though every syllable dripped with restrained anger. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a brief silence before he spoke. They have no idea what they just did. His words were steady, almost chilling in their certainty. He promised to mobilize some of his contacts and dig into the HOA's financials, leadership structure, and any prior complaints. Next, I called my cousin, a federal prosecutor known for her ruthless pursuit of justice. Her reaction mirrored my brother's, controlled but lethal in intent. She assured me that once we gathered evidence, the legal repercussions would be catastrophic for the HOA and anyone complicit in this demolition. By the time I hung up, my despair had transformed into determination. The HOA believed this was over. They thought their sign was the final word. What they didn't realize was that they had just ignited a chain of events that would expose their entire operation. The following day, I returned to the site with a high-resolution camera and a drone. I surveyed the area, capturing every detail from above. The demolition wasn't sloppy, it was deliberate and professional, which meant they had hired contractors. That was their first mistake. Contractors leave paper trails, permits, invoices, communication logs. I retrieved soil samples, knowing that debris fragments could tell me what kind of machinery was used and when. I also noticed something else, fragments of wood and nails scattered near the tree line. They hadn't cleaned the site completely, and these remnants could serve as physical evidence of the structure that once stood here. I carefully collected and bagged everything, labeling each item like a crime scene investigator. Because, in essence, that's what this was, a crime. Later that afternoon, I drove to the county records office to pull every document related to my property. There was no demolition permit on file, which confirmed what I suspected. This wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. They hadn't gone through the proper channels because they assumed no one would fight back. That night, I sat at my desk, surrounded by files, photographs, and notes. A whiteboard stood against the wall, filled with names, dates, and arrows connecting pieces of information. The HOA board members, their roles, and their financial interests were all laid out in meticulous detail. And as the picture became clearer, so did their motives. This wasn't about unpaid fees, it was about control and money. The board president, a man named Harold Briggs, stood at the center of it all. A quick search revealed he had ties to several construction firms in the area. I suspected the HOA was using compliance enforcement as a weapon, forcing demolitions, then profiting from rebuilds through kickbacks and inflated contracts. It was a scheme hiding in plain sight, and they had just involved the wrong person. As midnight approached, I received a message from my brother. It was a single line that made my pulse quicken. Found something big. Call me. I dialed immediately. His voice was calm but laced with anticipation. He had uncovered bank transfers linking the HOA's operating account to a private LLC controlled by Briggs. The amounts were too large and too frequent to be legitimate reimbursements. This wasn't mismanagement, it was embezzlement on a scale that could land them in federal prison. That was when I knew this wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. They hadn't only stolen from me, they had been stealing from the entire community, hiding behind legal jargon and fabricated fines. The next steps were clear: build an airtight case, expose the corruption, and ensure every single person involved paid for what they did. They demolished my cabin thinking it would end a dispute over fees. What they didn't realize was that they had sparked a war they couldn't win. And I was just getting started. The sun rose on what seemed like an ordinary morning, but for me, the gears of something far greater were already in motion. I wasn't simply seeking retribution, I was orchestrating a takedown that would dismantle an entire system of corruption. The HOA had built its power on intimidation and silence, assuming no one would dare challenge their authority. That illusion was about to shatter. With every passing hour, the evidence grew. My brother had assembled a preliminary report that read like a blueprint of criminal enterprise: unauthorized demolitions, inflated fines, off-the-books transactions. The bank transfers linking the HOA to Briggs' private LLC were only the beginning. A deeper dive into the accounts revealed patterns, a steady flow of funds funneling out under the guise of maintenance projects and community enhancements. The totals were staggering. But exposing financial corruption alone wouldn't deliver the justice I wanted. What they did to my cabin went beyond numbers, it was a physical act of destruction, carried out without due process. That meant someone approved it, someone signed off on it, and someone hired the crew that turned decades of memories into rubble. I needed names, dates, and proof. So, I started digging into the contractors. The first lead came from a scrap of paper my drone footage captured, a faded logo on the side of a dump truck parked near the demolition site. A quick online search tied it to a small construction company operating in the county. They specialized in property clearances and had a reputation for discretion. Perfect for an HOA that wanted things done quietly. I made a few calls, nothing incriminating, just casual inquiries posing as a potential client. They bragged about fast turnaround and handling tricky situations. That was all I needed to confirm they were willing participants, not innocent hires. Every conversation was recorded, every detail catalogued. Meanwhile, my cousin, the federal prosecutor, was laying the legal foundation. She advised me to stay methodical, build a timeline, document violations, and avoid confrontation until the case was bulletproof. But that didn't mean the HOA was unaware. By the end of the week, I noticed the first sign that they suspected something. A black SUV parked near the lake entrance. No plates, tinted windows, engine running. When I slowed to get a better look, the vehicle pulled away. It wasn't paranoia, I knew surveillance when I saw it. They were watching me. This didn't intimidate me, it confirmed I was making progress. They had operated in the shadows for years, and now someone was shining a light on them. Panic was creeping in, and when people like Briggs panic, they make mistakes. The following day, a certified letter arrived at my home. The envelope bore the HOA's seal, and inside was a single page filled with carefully chosen words. Cease and desist any defamatory actions against the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal consequences. A desperate move, thinly veiled as a legal warning. They wanted to scare me into silence. Instead, it fueled my resolve. I drafted a formal response, citing federal statutes on property rights, due process, and unauthorized demolition. I made sure it sounded calm, professional, and impossible to misinterpret as weakness. At the bottom, I added a single line that I knew would unsettle them. This matter has been referred to federal authorities. And it had. My brother had already passed the financial data to his agency's fraud division, while my cousin began preparing a preliminary injunction to freeze the HOA's accounts. But this wasn't just a legal battle anymore, it was a psychological one. Every letter I sent, every move I made was calculated to push them closer to the edge. Then came the breakthrough I'd been waiting for. Late one evening, my brother called with news that turned the case from strong to airtight. He had obtained copies of internal HOA emails, communications between Briggs and his board members discussing strategic demolitions and accelerating compliance actions for delinquent properties. The language was damning. Phrases like maximize asset recovery and fast-track clearance for resale left no room for misinterpretation. They weren't enforcing rules, they were running an organized racket to seize properties and flip them for profit. Even worse, one email mentioned my name explicitly. It read, "Owner has been resistant. Proceed with clearance as scheduled. Ensure no delays." That was all the confirmation I needed. This wasn't a misunderstanding or clerical error, they had targeted me deliberately. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer the picture became, the HOA wasn't just corrupt, it was predatory. They preyed on vulnerable homeowners, those too elderly, too busy, or too uninformed to fight back. They manufactured debts, imposed arbitrary rules, and, when all else failed, used demolition as a final weapon. And now, the very system they built to control others was about to collapse on top of them. Still, I had to be careful. If they were bold enough to bulldoze my property without a permit, they were bold enough to try something reckless when cornered. So, I began taking precautions, security cameras around my home, discreet alerts set up with local law enforcement, and, most importantly, an unshakable paper trail documenting every interaction. As the weekend approached, my cousin called with an update. The judge had reviewed the evidence and granted an emergency order to freeze the HOA's operating accounts. It was the first domino to fall, and when those funds stopped flowing, their entire machine would grind to a halt. The trap was set, and the walls were closing in. But I wasn't finished, not yet. I wanted Briggs and every accomplice to feel the weight of accountability, to experience the same sense of helplessness they had inflicted on others. They thought they could bulldoze their problems into the ground. Now they were about to learn what happens when their victims fight back, with the full force of the law. And this was only the beginning of their nightmare. By the time Monday rolled around, the HOA's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. It started quietly, subtle shifts that only someone watching closely would notice. Emails slowed. The smug tone in their correspondence disappeared, replaced by abrupt, formal replies that sounded almost robotic. Their confidence was evaporating, and I was the reason. The first real blow landed that morning. A court order had been executed to freeze all HOA operating accounts, pending investigation. The local bank manager, bound by law, complied immediately. The HOA board members, accustomed to an uninterrupted stream of homeowner dues and fines, suddenly found themselves staring at zero liquidity. Their financial lifeline was severed. They couldn't pay vendors, contractors, or even their own legal counsel without dipping into personal funds. I didn't have to imagine the chaos, I knew exactly what it looked like. Briggs and his cronies would be sitting around a glossy boardroom table, faces pale, voices rising as reality sank in. Their empire of intimidation was unraveling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But this was only the start. Within 24 hours, federal subpoenas landed in the HOA office like thunderclaps. The fraud division had opened a formal investigation into wire fraud, racketeering, and property destruction. Agents began collecting records, hard drives, and financial statements. Every email, every transaction, every backroom deal they thought was buried was now evidence in a growing case file, and then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife deeper, local media caught wind of the story. A headline blared across the evening news. Lake Serenity HOA under federal investigation for property seizures and fraud. The broadcast showed footage of homeowners gathered outside the association's office, their anger boiling over. For years, these people had lived under the HOA's iron grip, swallowing their frustration because they feared retaliation. Now, they had a voice, and it was roaring. Some shared their stories on camera, wrongful fines, threats of foreclosure, even rumors of other illegal demolitions. My case had opened the floodgates, and the tide was turning fast. Meanwhile, I stayed in the shadows, letting the machine do its work. This wasn't about theatrics, it was about precision. Every step I'd taken, every photo, every document, every conversation, was now part of an airtight case that would leave no room for escape. But Briggs didn't go down quietly. Midweek, I received a letter slipped under my door, not by mail, but by hand. The paper was plain, the handwriting jagged and rushed. "You've made a mistake. Back off before this gets ugly." A threat. Predictable, desperate, and utterly futile. If Briggs thought intimidation would work, he hadn't learned a thing. I took a photo of the note, sealed it in an evidence bag, and forwarded a copy to my brother. Threatening a federal agent, even indirectly, is a federal offense in itself. With that single act, Briggs had added another charge to his growing list of crimes. The following day brought an even bigger development. My cousin called with an update that made my pulse quicken. A federal judge had authorized asset seizures. Briggs' accounts were frozen, his personal property flagged for forfeiture. Vehicles, real estate holdings, even the cushy vacation home he'd purchased with stolen HOA funds, all now under government lock. Word spread quickly, and by Thursday morning, the HOA office was swarming with agents. Boxes of files were hauled out, computers confiscated. Board members were escorted out of the building for questioning, their once arrogant demeanor replaced by blank stares and trembling hands. The same neighbors they had bullied for years now stood outside, cheering as their oppressors were paraded into unmarked cars. As the chaos unfolded, I returned to the lake property one last time. The sight of that empty clearing still stirred a deep ache, but now it carried something else, vindication. This ground, once a symbol of loss, had become the starting point of justice. I knelt and pressed my hand against the soil, making a silent promise: the cabin would rise again. But first, the people responsible for its destruction had to face consequences so severe they would never forget. And those consequences were coming faster than they could imagine. Briggs was scheduled for a preliminary hearing the next morning, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Wire fraud. Embezzlement. Conspiracy. Unauthorized demolition. Each charge stacked like bricks in a wall sealing his fate. Still, I wasn't satisfied. Not yet. I wanted the full network exposed, the contractors who turned a blind eye, the board members who rubber-stamped illegal actions, the attorneys who weaponized the legal system for personal gain. They had all played a role, and they would all pay. The story was gaining national traction now. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, hungry for details. Commentators debated HOA power abuse, lawmakers called for reform, and homeowners across the country began questioning the unchecked authority of these associations. What started as a personal tragedy was becoming a movement, a reckoning long overdue. And in the middle of it all stood one undeniable fact: the HOA had demolished the wrong cabin. They thought they could erase my home, silence my voice, and walk away unscathed. Instead, they had triggered a chain reaction that would dismantle everything they built on greed and arrogance. Tomorrow, Briggs would stand before a judge. And for the first time in his life, the man who once wielded fear like a weapon would taste what it felt like to be powerless. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration. And I intended to rebuild not only my cabin but the trust this community had lost. The real work was about to begin. The courthouse buzzed with tension the following morning. What had started as whispers about an investigation had erupted into a full-blown scandal, and every media outlet within 100 miles wanted a piece of it. Vans with satellite dishes lined the street, reporters clustered by the steps, and camera flashes lit the air like fireworks. Briggs had always enjoyed attention when it was on his terms: community meetings, ribbon cuttings, HOA luncheons. But today, the spotlight wasn't flattering. It was blinding, accusatory, and merciless. I didn't need to be in the courtroom to know what was happening. My cousin was there, front row, representing federal interests. She kept me updated in real time, her texts hitting my phone like drumbeats of poetic justice. Hearing started. Briggs looked shaken. Judge denied bail. That last one made me pause, a slow smile spreading across my face. Briggs wasn't going home. Not tonight, not anytime soon. His empire of intimidation had evaporated the moment the gavel struck. The man who bulldozed my family's memories without a second thought now sat in a holding cell, stripped of power, influence, and control. But Briggs wasn't alone. As the investigation widened, subpoenas ensnared every major player on the HOA board. One by one, they were called in for questioning, their polished facades cracking under the weight of evidence. Some tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. Others attempted to cut deals, offering names in exchange for leniency. It didn't matter, there was enough proof to sink the entire ship. Financial audits revealed layers of fraud so intricate it was hard to believe they operated in plain sight. Inflated invoices for maintenance projects that never happened. Kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. Homeowners billed for security upgrades that led straight into Briggs' personal accounts. The HOA wasn't just corrupt, it was predatory to its core. As news of the scandal spread, the community transformed. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now gathered openly, sharing stories of harassment, bogus fines, and threats they'd endured in silence. Some were angry, others relieved, but all felt a sense of liberation. The fear that had hung over Lake Serenity like a storm cloud was finally breaking apart. For me, the moment of vindication came when the federal task force invited me to review the case summary. I sat in a sterile conference room, stacks of evidence spread across the table, bank statements, email chains, demolition contracts. Each page was another nail in the coffin of an organization that had thrived on unchecked power. Then I saw it, a document that stopped me cold. A projected revenue report titled Strategic Property Turnover Plan. It listed targeted homes, estimated demolition dates, and projected resale values. My cabin was on that list, marked with a note. High-value rebuild opportunity. Owner resistant, proceed as scheduled. The audacity was staggering. They hadn't just targeted me randomly, they had mapped out a plan to convert entire parts of the community into a profit machine. Families weren't just paying HOA dues, they were feeding a beast that would eventually devour them. Now the beast was dead. But as satisfying as it was to watch their empire crumble, I couldn't ignore the void left behind. My cabin was still gone, reduced to debris and dust. Justice could punish the guilty, but it couldn't rebuild what they had taken. That responsibility fell to me, and I was ready for it. That I spent the next few days meeting with architects and contractors, men and women I trusted, not the shady operators Briggs used to line his pockets. Together, we walked the empty lot where the cabin once stood. I told them stories of what had been there, the rocking chair by the fireplace, the creaky porch steps, the view of the lake that could steal your breath at sunset. But this rebuild wasn't just about nostalgia, it was about resilience. I wanted a structure that honored the past yet stood as a monument to everything we'd overcome. Stronger, smarter, and untouchable by any HOA or self-appointed dictator. While plans took shape, the HOA's remnants imploded in spectacular fashion. A court-appointed receiver seized control of their operations, freezing all decision-making and liquidating assets to pay legal settlements. Homeowners voted to dissolve the association entirely, opting for a simpler, self-managed model. No more arbitrary rules, no more inflated fines, just neighbors working together without fear or favoritism. It was poetic justice, but it came with a bitter aftertaste. Too many families had suffered before the system cracked. Some lost money they would never recover, others lost faith in institutions that promised protection but delivered tyranny. That reality weighed on me, fueling a determination that went beyond personal revenge. My cousin shared a thought during one of our late-night calls. This case could set a precedent. If you push, it could change how HOAs operate nationwide. The idea stuck with me. Maybe my fight wasn't just about a cabin anymore. Maybe it was about challenging a system that handed too much unchecked power to too few people. Briggs had been extreme, but he wasn't unique. Across the country, similar stories simmered under the surface, ordinary families bullied into submission by boards drunk on authority. And now, for the first time, someone had cracked the code. Still, as noble as those thoughts were, I couldn't escape one truth: my fight had started with something deeply personal. Standing on that empty lot again, blueprint in hand, I felt the weight of both loss and possibility. This ground wasn't just soil, it was a canvas. And soon, it would hold more than a cabin. It would hold a statement. The demolition that was meant to break me had done the opposite. It had forged me into something unshakable. And while Briggs sat in a cell wondering how everything unraveled so fast, I was about to build something no one could tear down, not with bulldozers, not with threats, not with greed. The foundation was coming. The months that followed were a blur of blueprints, permits, and construction crews. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the silence that had haunted the clearing since the day I found it empty. Piece by piece, the new cabin began to rise, not as a replica of the old one, but as something stronger, more enduring. Every nail driven into timber felt like a declaration: you tried to erase me, and I refused to disappear. I spared no detail in making sure this rebuild was untouchable. The foundation was reinforced, the structure built to last for generations. Modern touches blended with traditional charm: the stone fireplace, the wraparound porch, the expansive windows framing the lake in all its glory. This wasn't just a home, it was a symbol of resilience. But as satisfying as the rebuild was, I knew the true victory wasn't in wood and stone. It was in accountability. Briggs and his co-conspirators had faced the full weight of justice. The trial stretched for months, revealing corruption so deep it shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, unauthorized demolitions, the charges stacked higher than their egos ever had. Briggs, once the king of Lake Serenity, now wore an orange jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary. His board members fared no better. Some took plea deals, others fought and lost. Restitution was ordered, assets liquidated, reputations destroyed. The HOA itself ceased to exist, dissolved by court order. Its name, once wielded like a weapon, was now a cautionary tale whispered across the country. The ripple effect didn't stop there. News of the case went national, sparking debates on HOA overreach and homeowner rights. Lawmakers proposed reforms. Communities demanded transparency. For years, HOAs had operated like little monarchies, accountable to no one. That era was ending, and it started with a single cabin on a quiet lake. For me, the fight had never been about headlines. It had been about something far more personal. That day when I stood on bare earth, staring at the void where my family's history once lived, I vowed to set things right. And now, as I stood on the porch of the new cabin, overlooking the water bathed in golden light, I felt that vow fulfilled. The cabin was beautiful, but it was more than aesthetics. It carried a message etched into every beam: never let fear silence you, and never underestimate the power of one voice backed by determination, and in my case, an entire family of federal agents who refused to let injustice stand. I invited my family to celebrate the completion. We gathered on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the lake. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the soft rustle of the trees. It felt right, like the land itself was breathing again after months of tension. Later that night, after everyone had gone inside, I stepped out alone. The moon reflected on the water, calm and steady, as if reminding me that storms don't last forever. I thought about the neighbors who had suffered in silence, the families who had lived under the HOA's thumb for years. Many had thanked me for fighting back, for shining a light on the darkness they thought would never lift. That gratitude mattered more than any court victory. I took a slow breath, letting the crisp night air settle in my lungs. This wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. A beginning for me, for this land, and maybe even for countless others who would draw courage from this story. The cabin stood tall now, but the real structure I built wasn't made of wood or stone. It was made of principle, integrity, and resolve. Briggs and his cronies had believed power was permanent, that greed could go unchecked. They were wrong. As I turned to go inside, I glanced one last time at the lake. Its surface was calm, but I knew what lurked beneath, the strength of currents unseen, like the strength we all hold when we refuse to be broken. The HOA thought they could destroy me. Instead, they built the stage for their own downfall. And me? I built something stronger than a cabin. I built a legacy.